It started with a quiet sort of understanding, the kind that creeps in slowly over years and then suddenly feels undeniable. 7.5 years, it wasn't a short time, and yet somehow it ended without the usual fireworks. Without the screaming matches or bitter accusations that I had always imagined a breakup would have. I had spent so many nights imagining the worst, and now here it was, calm, amicable, but weighted with its own peculiar tension. We were friends, still good friends, which meant that every step we took toward separation had to be measured. Delicate, a dance on fragile ground. I had never thought I would feel this mix of relief and guilt simultaneously, but that's exactly what it was. Relief because the decision felt right, necessary even, and guilt because I was, in some corner of my heart, afraid of disappointing him, of letting our long history dissolve into resentment. Financially, we had always been independent. Separate accounts, separate savings, a separate understanding of what was ours and what was shared. It was almost a source of pride for me, knowing that we had built a partnership without entangling money in ways that might complicate love. He had a head start, 10 years of work experience when I was still navigating university and part-time jobs, barely able to pay rent without scraping. I had played catch-up for years, and now I earned a salary that surpassed his. Though the comfort of his early savings always made me aware of the uneven playing field we'd inherited from our choices and timing. We had no kids, no joint mortgages, no entangling assets that would require lawyers or spreadsheets to unravel. It should have made the separation straightforward. Yet, the emotional landscape was messier than any financial ledger could ever reflect. When I decided to buy my first home, it felt like the most adult thing I had ever done, a tangible declaration of independence. Renting had been comfortable but unremarkable, and I wanted something permanent, something mine. He, meanwhile, was struggling to qualify for a mortgage, the result of some unwise financial choices that had haunted him. It wasn't a disaster. His broker had laid out a clear, 3-month path to fix everything. In the meantime, he arranged to live with a friend, which seemed perfectly reasonable. But then came the complication I hadn't anticipated, the logistics of his hoarding. Our old garage and attic were testament to a life collected over years, some things sentimental, some things pointless, all things stubbornly refused to be discarded. His belongings spilled into corners and shelves, stacked haphazardly, a silent insistence that he couldn't let go. When I bought my house, I had a large shed, and in a moment of what I thought was generosity, I offered him temporary storage. It was meant to be a practical solution. He could place his things somewhere secure, and I could move forward with my new life without the stress of his clutter. He accepted with gratitude, relief even, and for a moment, I imagined it would work perfectly, a seamless solution bridging our transition from lovers to friends. But gratitude has a shelf life, and the longer it lasts, the more easily it curdles into expectation. Tonight, he came home with news that made my heart sink. His new housing deal on all-inclusive arrangement with meals included was just $200 a week. A bargain, considering he was earning around $75,000 a year. On the surface, it seemed sensible. But then he added the kicker. He intended to stay there for a whole year. That one word, year, made my chest tighten. 12 months of being expected to store mountains of his belongings in my shed. 12 months of maintaining what was, in my mind, a temporary courtesy, suddenly became an imposition I couldn't swallow. I lost my composure. My calm, reasoned approach evaporated like mist under a harsh sun. I told him, sharply, that my offer was off the table if he expected me to shoulder this burden for half a year or more. He froze, sulking instantly, a wound I hadn't intended to inflict, but was perhaps inevitable. I felt guilt like a cold stone in my stomach, a reminder that even well-intentioned boundaries could sting when enforced. His disappointment was palpable, an almost physical presence that pressed against my resolve. And yet, beneath it all, I knew I was justified. I was not a storage unit. I was not a repository for years of collected belongings simply because history made me feel obligated. The room felt heavy, filled with unsaid words. He avoided my gaze, muttering excuses about practicality and convenience. I felt the tension twist like a vine around my ribs. There was a part of me that longed to retreat, to mollify, to apologize for being sharp. But the truth was this: boundaries are hard to maintain when the people you care about are upset. But they are essential, and my shed was not a symbol of our friendship, was my space, my start at independence, and it could not become an extension of a past life I had deliberately chosen to leave behind. I replayed the conversation in my head on the drive home, in the quiet of my empty apartment, in the brief pauses between chores and daily routines. Every angle I considered made the same point. I was right to enforce limits. His hoarding problem was not my problem. My generosity had limits, and those limits were being tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. The guilt lingered, a faint echo, but it was overpowered by clarity. I remembered the early days of our relationship, the excitement of shared experiences, the small, secret joys of building a life together without being tied to one another's bank accounts. I remembered the warmth of being appreciated, of being seen. But I also remembered the subtle ways in which our differences had played out over time, how his cautious saving sometimes clashed with my impulsive independence, how his attachment to things sometimes weighed on me without him realizing. And now, as we navigated this transition, those differences were laid bare in the shed and the garage, in the stacks of forgotten boxes and the old furniture that had survived moves and minor renovations. Friendship after partnership is a precarious thing, and I was learning, painfully, how to balance empathy with self-preservation. It was not a betrayal to acknowledge my limits, nor was it cruelty to enforce them. And yet, the immediate aftermath of my decision was a tangible tension that filled the space between us. He was upset, clearly hurt, and I felt a pang of sorrow not for his feelings, but for the fact that our amicable separation now carried the weight of conflict. Even if temporary, I spent hours that night reorganizing my shed, imagining how it would look empty, how the space could finally belong to me without being crowded by relics of someone else's past. There was satisfaction in the thought, but also melancholy. This was part of ending a long-term relationship, the negotiation between past and present, between kindness and self-preservation. I had wanted to be generous, to bridge the gap between our old life and our new. But generosity without boundaries can become a trap, and I refused to fall into one. As I lay in bed, I contemplated the peculiar intimacy of separation, the way it magnifies every quirk, every habit, every assumption we once tolerated or overlooked. His hoarding, once a minor irritation, had now become a significant stressor. My desire to maintain my own autonomy clashed with his expectation of temporary support. And in that clash, I discovered something essential about myself. I was capable of compassion, but I was also capable of saying no. That realization, small but powerful, was both comforting and isolating. The night stretched long. The house quiet except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the muted ticking of the clock. I replayed the conversation again and again, weighing my words, wondering if I had been too harsh, if I had hurt him unnecessarily. But each replay brought me back to the same conclusion. Kindness without limits is not kindness, is self-erasure. My shed, my new home, my new life could not be sacrificed to maintain an illusion of friendship rooted in old dependence. And so, despite the sharp edge of guilt, I slept with the knowledge that I had done the right thing for myself. Morning brought clarity, but also anticipation of the inevitable next conversation. He would bring up the shed, the boxes, the question of when his things would move, and I would have to repeat my stance. I knew it would sting him. I also knew it was necessary. This was not about money, not about Spartit. It was about boundaries, about respect, about carving out space to breathe, to grow, to exist independently after years of shared life. I reminded myself that amicable separation does not mean endless accommodation, and that compassion does not require surrender. Even as I prepared coffee and opened the blinds to let sunlight spill across the kitchen floor, I felt a mixture of apprehension and resolve. Our lives had intertwined for so long, but now they were branching in different directions. And branching requires room, requires the courage to let go of obligations that no longer serve mutual growth. He would be upset, certainly, but that was a temporary discomfort compared to the long-term erosion of my autonomy. The shed, once a symbol of temporary support, had become a litmus test for the limits of generosity, and I had chosen to honor those limits. As I finished my coffee and glanced at the quiet streets outside, I realized that this was only the beginning of a new chapter. Separation is never a single event. It is a series of small decisions, repeated moments of self-assertion, tests of patience and compassion. And tonight, the first true test had already taken place. I had drawn a line, and while it had left him sulking and hurt, it had also affirmed something I had long suspected. The courage to protect oneself is sometimes the only way to maintain genuine care for another. The next few days were tense in a way I hadn't anticipated. At first, he avoided bringing up the shed, likely hoping the tension would dissipate on its own. But avoidance never lasts, not with hoarding involved. Each time I walked past my neatly organized shed, my heart sank slightly, a small reminder of the unspoken standoff that hung over us like a storm cloud. His belongings, once a manageable collection of boxes, had now become a psychological weight in my mind. I could see them every time I walked by, stacked in my mind as much as in physical space. A reminder that my generosity had a price, and that the price was being calculated in silent resentment. We met for coffee one morning, a ritual we had maintained even during the separation, and the air between us was taut. He started carefully, cautiously, about his new living arrangement. "It's perfect, really," he said, trying to mask a hint of defensiveness. "Meals included, I don't have to worry about bills, and I can save up for the mortgage. It's really convenient." I nodded, acknowledging his good fortune. But my mind kept returning to the shed and the reality of his storage needs. 12 months was a long time to long, and the weight of what I was expected to accommodate made me tighten my jaw without realizing it. I explained calmly, though with a firmness that surprised even me, that my offer could no longer stand if it involved him storing his things for 6 months or more. I tried to make it clear that this wasn't about his housing situation or about punishing him. It was about boundaries, and the necessity of establishing limits in a way that preserved my own well-being. He sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that carried years of accumulated frustration and disappointment. "I thought this was temporary," he muttered, almost to himself. But I knew he was also trying to mask his hurt. Hoarding is a funny thing. It's never just about objects. It's about memory, control, identity. His attachment to the boxes, the stacks of furniture, the seemingly random collection of things he refused to discard, was an extension of him, and I understood that intellectually. Emotionally, however, I was drained. I had to remind myself that compassion does not mean endless accommodation. I could care for him, I could even empathize with the difficulty of letting go, but I could not allow his habits to dictate the terms of my life. In the days that followed, he tried to negotiate. "I could just store some of it elsewhere," he said, though I could tell he was angling for me to shoulder the bulk of the load. "Maybe just the heavier stuff, the furniture. It won't take up too much space." I listened patiently, but internally, I was shaking my head. No, it wouldn't take up too much space. It would take up months of my mental and emotional energy. It would tether me to a past life I was trying to leave behind. I reminded him that he had options. Temporary storage units, friends with space, even some I offered practical suggestions, but each seemed to meet resistance. The invisible barrier of hoarding stubbornly refusing to budge. It was during one particularly awkward encounter, in the garage, that the tension came to a head. He was attempting to move a stack of boxes that leaned precariously, as if the weight of indecision itself had settled on them. I tried to help, but my patience snapped at the sight of him attempting to wedge more into an already overflowing space. "Look, I can't do this," I said firmly. "I'm not your storage facility. I offered temporary space. That's it. You need to make other arrangements if you plan to stay there for a year." His face fell, a mixture of hurt and frustration, and I saw the familiar tightness around his jaw, the way he tensed when he felt cornered. He accused me of being unsympathetic, of turning my back on him, and for a moment I felt that old, familiar guilt gnawing at my resolve. But I reminded myself that sympathy does not require surrender. I could be empathetic without sacrificing my independence. I could care without accommodating indefinitely. And I had to, because the alternative was allowing my generosity to be exploited, allowing the past to dictate the terms of my future. I started researching storage alternatives, calling facilities, comparing costs. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. Each phone call reminded me that the solution existed beyond my own home, beyond my own space, and that his needs, while valid, were not obligations I had to meet. He resisted at first, the idea of paying for storage or relying on another friend uncomfortable for him. But eventually, practicality began to outweigh sentimentality. The shed, once a symbol of generosity, had become a battleground of boundaries, and the negotiations, though polite, carried an undercurrent of unspoken tension. Our interactions became increasingly careful, polite, each conversation punctuated by pauses and sighs, each silence laden with what was not said. He would glance at my shed, then quickly look away, a subtle acknowledgement of the limits I had set. I, in turn, reminded myself that maintaining these boundaries was an act of self-respect, of preserving my mental and emotional health. Friendship after partnership is tricky. There is a constant tension between compassion and assertion, between care and self-protection. I was learning, painfully, that sometimes the kindest act is the one that preserves your own space. One evening, I came home to find him attempting to catalogue his belongings, labeling boxes with careful attention, clearly aware that his temporary claim on my shed was coming to an end. There was a strange poignancy in watching him organize, as if he were both preparing for independence and grieving the convenience I had initially offered. I realized then that our separation was teaching us both lessons about limits and self-sufficiency, about the balance between care and autonomy. Through all of this, I learned to articulate my boundaries more clearly, to express my needs without apology, to stand firm even when faced with guilt or disappointment. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I questioned whether my sharpness had been unnecessary, whether a softer approach might have sufficed. But in the quiet moments of reflection, I knew I was right. I had the right to protect my space, my independence, my mental well-being. Temporary generosity should not become permanent burden, and my clarity on that point became my compass through the murky waters of post-separation dynamics. We eventually reached a compromise. He would move the bulk of his belongings into temporary storage, and I would help with the logistics of transporting some items to his new place when the mortgage issue was resolved. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair, and most importantly, it maintained my boundaries while still allowing me to be supportive in a practical, sustainable way. The shed, once overfilled, was empty again, a symbol of autonomy restored. And as I looked around my home, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not vindictive, not resentful, but simply grounded in the knowledge that generosity had limits, and that I had honored them. In the end, the storage conflict became a turning point, a lesson in the delicate art of separating friendship from obligation, compassion from self-sacrifice. He was still upset, sure, but he was learning, just as I was. That respect for boundaries is not cruelty, is necessary for healthy interaction, even post-relationship. The shed, now empty, was more than just a physical space. It was a metaphor for the space I had carved in my life, the independence I had fought to maintain, and the emotional resilience I had discovered through confrontation and compromise. By the time we entered the third week after the shed standoff, the air between us had shifted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Tension still lingered, but the sharp edges had dulled, replaced by a cautious, fragile understanding that neither of us wanted to fracture further. I began to see the situation with more clarity, appreciating the lessons it had imparted about boundaries, independence, and the importance of self-respect. My decision to revoke the temporary storage offer had not been easy, but as I reflected on the experience, I understood why it was necessary, not just for my own mental and emotional well-being, but for the integrity of our relationship as friends. He was still visibly upset. The initial sulking replaced by quieter frustration, a kind of simmering disappointment that he had learned to mask behind polite conversation. I noticed that he avoided discussing logistics unless absolutely necessary, and when he did, it was measured, careful, almost apologetic. I realized that in confronting this conflict, we were both being forced to grow in ways that our long-term partnership had never required. He had to confront his hoarding habits and take responsibility for his belongings. I had to confront my limits, articulate my needs, and hold firm even in the face of guilt and lingering attachment. One evening, we met at a cafe to finalize some of the arrangements for moving his things. The conversation was civil, productive even, and I was struck by how much we had both matured through this process. He acknowledged that staying in my shed for a year had been unrealistic and admitted that he hadn't fully considered the impact on me. I, in turn, acknowledged that my initial reaction had been sharp, but explained that my boundaries were non-negotiable because they were essential to my sense of autonomy. For the first time, I sensed a genuine shift in understanding that friendship could survive the assertion of personal limits, and perhaps even thrive because of it. In the weeks that followed, he arranged for a temporary storage unit, choosing one closer to his new home so that he could gradually move things as he sorted his finances. I assisted only minimally, helping him coordinate transport, but I made it clear that my involvement had limits. The physical burden of his belongings no longer loomed over me, and with that, a sense of emotional freedom returned. The shed, once a crowded, stressful space, was now empty, organized, and welcoming a tangible reflection of my boundaries and the control I had reclaimed over my own environment. Through this process, I realized that the real challenge had not been the physical act of storing his items, but the emotional labor that accompanied it. Hoarding, after all, is rarely about mere objects. It's about control, attachment, and sometimes fear of letting go. By refusing to accommodate his habits indefinitely, I wasn't rejecting him personally. I was rejecting a pattern that could have consumed my life. And in doing so, I was affirming something fundamental. The care for others does not require erasure of the self. True support is sustainable and respects mutual boundaries. The dynamic between us evolved subtly but profoundly. Conversations became lighter, tinged with humor and nostalgia rather than frustration. We began to reminisce about shared experiences from our 7.5 years together, finding moments of warmth and connection that didn't threaten our independence. I discovered that enforcing boundaries didn't have to mean hostility. It could coexist with friendship if handled with honesty and care. The shed, empty and organized, became a metaphor for the space we had carved in our new lives, space free from the emotional clutter that had accumulated over years of cohabitation. I also noticed a shift in his behavior. He became more mindful of his possessions, more conscious of the impact of his hoarding on others. The temporary storage unit became not just a practical solution, but a symbolic step toward personal growth. I could see that he was learning responsibility in a tangible way, gradually gaining control over his environment rather than relying on the convenience of my generosity. And I realized, with quiet satisfaction, that my decision to enforce boundaries had contributed to that growth. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, and in that necessity there was validation. Our interactions, once fraught with tension, began to feel more genuine. We laughed together again, shared stories without the undercurrent of resentment, and even started planning casual social activities that didn't involve logistical stress or emotional labor. It was a new kind of relationship, one defined by mutual respect and clear boundaries rather than dependence or obligation. The process had been challenging, but it had also been enlightening. I had learned that assertiveness and empathy are not mutually exclusive, that one can care deeply for another without surrendering autonomy, and that true friendship can endure even when generosity is measured and finite. By the time his new mortgage situation was resolved, he had moved most of his belongings into his own space. I helped with the last few boxes, the final pieces of furniture, and as we placed the last item in his new home, I felt a sense of closure, a recognition of the journey we had both undertaken. There was no bitterness, no lingering tension, just the quiet satisfaction of two people who had navigated a difficult transition with honesty and respect. Looking back, I realized that the shed conflict had been a turning point, It had forced both of us to confront uncomfortable truths, to negotiate boundaries, and to take responsibility for our own lives. It had tested our friendship, challenged our patience, and ultimately strengthened our capacity for empathy and understanding. I had discovered the importance of maintaining personal space and the courage to enforce limits even when it caused temporary discomfort. He had discovered the value of accountability and the necessity of managing his own habits responsibly. In the end, we had both grown. The separation, once fraught with potential for resentment and misunderstanding, had become a testament to the resilience of friendship and the power of clear boundaries. I had learned that kindness does not require self-sacrifice, that empathy does not necessitate limitless accommodation, and that personal growth often comes from the courage to say no. Our lives had diverged, yes, but in that divergence, we had found a new equilibrium, one in which we could care for each other without compromising our own well-being. As I settled into my new home, the shed empty, the space organized and calm, I felt a sense of peace. The past was behind me, the future open, and I was free to build a life on my own terms, confident in the knowledge that boundaries are not barriers to friendship, but the very foundation of sustainable, meaningful relationships. The journey had been challenging, emotional, and at times painful, but it had ultimately reinforced something vital, that independence, clarity, and respect for one's own limits are essential, not just for personal well-being, but for the health of every relationship that follows. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and sunlight spilled across the floors, I reflected on the lessons learned. Generosity has limits. Kindness requires boundaries, and love, platonic, romantic, or otherwise, is healthiest when it coexists with. Our amicable separation had survived a test of hoarding, frustration, and expectation, emerging stronger because we had both faced the challenge with honesty and courage. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that this experience would shape every relationship I entered from this point forward. A constant reminder that true care for others begins with care for oneself.